Do you like stories about haunted locations? Or maybe tales of cryptids and spooky folklore from around the world? If so, why not tune in to Haunted Escapes with Chris and Diane, where all this and more will be discussed. New episodes drop every Sunday, with visual versions the following Friday on YouTube. So why not come join us on our Haunted Escapes?
Welcome to Ouch! Was That a Ghost? This podcast may contain graphic material, which some listeners may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised.
Help me.
Now that we covered that, here's your host, Liz.
Welcome back to Ouch! Was That a Ghost with me, Liz. So I've gotten so many requests for the Bridgewater Triangle, but it seems almost impossible to cover that before touching on King Philip's War, also known as the First Indian War, Metacomet's War, or Metacom's War. This was a brutal conflict between two cultures, Native American tribes and English colonists, who were a group of Europeans that called themselves Pilgrims. This was essentially each side trying to preserve their way of life. The Native Americans, including the Wampanoag, I always say Wampanoag, or the people of the First Light, were settled in Massachusetts and parts of Rhode Island for at least 12,000 years, long before 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. The year that Columbus had his European discovery of America. In school, I was taught 1620, the Pilgrims landed, and then it just seemed to skip over all of this until 1776, when independence, just passing over all of this horror that happened in New England. I'm not going to go super deep into it because it would be like a 5-parter, but I'm just going to give some highlights pertaining to King Philip's War. I suggest digging deeper. It's a very long and fascinating and also tragic story. In the 1600s, there was about 40,000 Wampanoag people living harmoniously in modern-day Massachusetts and Rhode Island, spread throughout 67 villages. They had sort of a nomadic lifestyle. They traveled to gather, to hunt, to fish, moving around to protect themselves from the elements. During the wintertime, they would move inland. They cared for the earth, and the earth cared for them. Since the beginning of the 16th century, England had been sending ships to the coast of North America, and the Europeans would come, they'd set up camp, they'd fish for the season, then they would leave. Native Americans knew about this, and they were just like okay with it. They were like, whatever, they're coming to fish, then they're taking off. But then they stopped just coming to fish. They would start to come fish, and then when they'd leave with the fish, they'd also take some Native Americans that they would enslave, and they would bring them back to Europe to put on, I don't even know how to say this, as like an exhibit, treating these humans like they were some strange sort of animal they found. In particular, in 1614, Captain John Smith and Thomas Hunt were mapping out the northeast coast of North America, which is now known as New England, or the New England coast. They ported at what is now called Plymouth, but it was Pawtuxet at the time. Captain John Smith left and continued north, mapping everything out. Thomas Hunt stayed, and he ended up enslaving 24 Native Americans, one of them being a man named Squantum, or Squanto, who was sold into the European slave trade. Squanto was then liberated to be a guide and interpreter for Captain Thomas Dermer. Eventually, he was freed and he was returned to his homeland in 1619. He went to go search for his tribe and they were all gone. His village, Pawtuxet, was like no more. He realized that in the time he was gone between 1616 and 1619, between 60 and 90% were dead from a disease that swept the area. The Wampanoag were hit very hard, while the Narragansett, another tribe in the area, didn't lose that many people to sickness that swept through the rest of the area. And they started receiving tribute from other tribes because now they were looked at like as a stronger tribe. They were thriving and they were the strongest tribe that was standing. Before the Europeans started coming to the area, the Native Americans lived secluded from the rest of the world, so their immune system was so different. So I assume it was the Europeans exploring, fishing, that brought diseases to the Native Americans that they couldn't fight off because their body had never encountered it before. So everyone has heard, or at least if you're from Massachusetts, about the Pilgrims discovering, in quotation marks, Plymouth. Their story starts in 1606 when a group of people wanted to leave the Church of England and they wanted to start their own church. So they were all charged with treason and banished from the area. And they first went to the Netherlands, but after 12 years of trying, they couldn't make it work. So 102 pilgrims took to making their own colony in America. So on November 11th, 1620, the Mayflower set down its anchor in what is now called Cape Cod, Massachusetts, where 41 men signed the Mayflower Compact, agreeing to a government chosen by common consent. Plymouth Colony was the first permanent English colony in New England settled by the Mayflower passengers, Plymouth Rock. You know? A treaty was made between the settlers and the chief with the help of Squanto, as he now spoke English and could translate for the Wampanoag chief Sassamon, aka Massasoit, and the Europeans, who then signed a peace treaty. It was called the Pilgrim-Wampanoag Peace Treaty, which promised mutual aid, and if either were attacked, the other would help protect the other. It also stated that each group is responsible for punishing their own in any crimes. The Wampanoag welcomed these visitors, showed them how to hunt, how to harvest, literally saving them from starvation. Massasoit's sons, Wamsuta and Metacomet, even took English names. The relations had to be pretty good to rename yourself for people that came into your area. Wamsuta took the name Alexander, and Metacomet took the name King Philip. And it seemed like it was pretty harmonious for about, 50 years. There were some issues between tribes, but little things. There was a time where the Narragansett tribe sent some arrows to the Wampanoag, which act almost as a declaration of war, and in turn the Wampanoag sent back bullets, just showing like the hostility between the tribes of the Wampanoags and the Narragansett. The semi-harmonious coexistence seemed to come to an end in the early 1670s, when the tension was just building between the two groups. They were arguing over laws, religions, crops, and the settlers' animals, the cows and the pigs, were trampling on the Native Americans' land, disrupting their way of life, ruining their crops. And the settlers were constantly trying to expand their land and forcing land sales against the Native Americans. There were agreements set, but the colonizers kept trying to be sneaky and get more land. We're now a little over 40 years after the Pilgrims' arrival, and King Massasoit passed away. After that, the settlers seemed to stop respecting the terms of the agreement, and tension was rising even more. His eldest son, Wamsuta, or King Alexander, was now the sachem or the chief. In 1662, Alexander was summoned to Plymouth to answer some questions about a possible plot against the settlers. I've read this two ways. One, that he was like, nah, I'm not being summoned by anyone, and they went and brought him by force, and on his journey he collapsed and died. The other one that I saw was that he went to Duxbury before a panel, and after this he went over to Marshfield to answer some questions for the then governor Joshua Winslow. After this meeting, Chief Alexander had to be carried back to Mount Hope due to his fever being so high, and he ended up passing away within 2 days. In either way of the stories, he ended up dying, and it was said to this day that he might have been poisoned. With Alexander's death, his younger brother, Metacomet, was now the sachem or chief, the one that's named King Philip now. He was then summoned to Plymouth. He reluctantly went, and when he got there, the settlers told Philip that the tribe had to hand over all their firearms. And to put this in perspective, now they'd been using guns for years. They relied on them for hunting, for protection, but he agrees, trying to keep the peace. When he returned to his tribe, they were not happy about the agreement. Metacom saw that the Pilgrim-Wampanoag peace treaty he made with his father was being honored less and less, and now he was being forced to hand over his weapons by a group of his supposed equals. It set like a really bad tone. Wampanoag started trying to trade to replace the weapons that they relied on, and colonizers heard whispers of this, and they saw it as a threat. We're now in 1675, and there's about 20,000 English settlers living in New England. The strongly Puritan bunch had set up 4 English colonies: Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Rhode Island was seen as like one of the lesser areas, having Baptists, Quakers, and others that didn't conform to the religion that the rest of the colonies were pushing. The Puritans had even converted quite a few Native Americans to Christianity, and these people were called praying Indians. But even though they were converted, these praying Indians were not looked at as equals. There was a lot of prejudice, a lot of poverty. In contrast to the 20,000 settlers, there was about 10,000 Native Americans who were getting pushed back further and further and further off their land. The Nipmuc, the Narragansett, the Mohegan, the Wampanoag. In January 1675, Joshua Winslow, the governor of Plymouth County, took a meeting with John Sassamon. He was raised as a Christian Native American, and then he went on to study at Harvard, leaving his home to join Philip. He acted as an interpreter and an advisor, and he seemed to understand the cultures of both the Native Americans and of the settlers, and many thought he was a spy for the other side, specifically spying on Philip. Sassamon was offered a job as a preacher in Marlborough, and it said that before he went to go start his new job, he stopped in Plymouth for a meeting with Governor Joshua Winslow to tell him about King Philip's plan to fight back. We're now in January 1675. John Sassamon was found beneath the ice in the frozen Assawampset Pond in Middleborough. He was dead with his neck snapped. And I don't know what to think of that, because to me, such a proud group of Native Americans, if they were going to kill him, why would they take such measures to hide the body? But what do I know? I wasn't there. A praying Indian named Patuxent was the witness who claims he saw these 3 men murder Sassamon, 3 of Philip's men. So the 3 men were put on trial and they were all found guilty. In June of 1675, the 3 were hung by ropes and 2 died immediately and 1 man just fell to the ground. And he was like, okay, he was killed, but they did it, not me. And the Europeans were like, yeah, no, and restrung him and completed the execution. Word of this got to Metacomet's land, Mount Hope, and they were pissed. This seemed to be a huge event in this war. An Indian crime on Indian land judged by English. This strictly contradicted the agreement that was made between the Europeans and King Massasoit, between the killing of his men and the tension that was building for years, over 50 years, constant land disputes, the prejudice, it seemed to spark what was about to start. 14 days later, the Wampanoag struck back when a Plymouth town, Swansea, was set ablaze and many of its residents were murdered. On June 27th, a group of soldiers from Mass Bay and Plymouth headed to Mount Hope to attack Philip. That night, there was a lunar eclipse that kind of scared the attackers. They saw it as like a bad omen. And the Indians saw this as a good sign, and they took this time of darkness to escape with 80 others on canoes. After this, there was guerrilla warfare everywhere. King Philip, the Wampanoag, the Nipmuc attacked many villages, slaughtering any English people and animals they found. They were lighting fields ablaze. For half a year, the English were losing at every turn. With all this war, Philip tried to clear out all the women and children and elderly, and he ended up sending them to stay with the Narragansett. Now, the Wampanoag and the Narragansett didn't have a great relationship, but most of them were related. So even if you're fighting with somebody, but, it's your cousin or your niece, you're going to let them stay with you, especially if they're women, children, elderly. During this time, a lot of Native Americans converted to Christianity, so now they were called praying Indians. The English feared that they would consort with the enemy, so they were all shipped off to the barren Deer Island, a place with 0 fresh water, no way to grow anything. They were basically secluded, and they had to fend for themselves, many starving to death or succumbing to the elements. English did fear the Narragansett, because you got to figure at the time there was about 1,500 English and about 15,000 Narragansett in Rhode Island. So in October of 1675, they made an agreement between the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Narragansett that they would stay out of the war. And the English even had the balls to ask for all the hostages, the Wampanoag refugees, and the Narragansett was like, yeah, that's not happening. So with this refusal, the English saw this as kind of an act of aggression. The United Colonies ended up sending 1,000 soldiers to Smith's Castle in Rhode Island. But the Narragansett knew that this might happen, so they prepared. They were located in like a swampy area. On December 19th, 1675, after days of trekking, soldiers came across a Narragansett camp. This camp was fortified, unlike anything they'd ever seen before. This was all during a blizzard. English are trying to attack, but they're being kicked back. They're failing. They're trying to attack again. They're trying different angles. They're actually hitting some of their own. And now bullets are bouncing off the houses, so they just got frustrated and ended up setting fire to 5 acres of the area, causing about 600 Native Americans, including women, children, to be slaughtered, along with over 70 English. So now the Narragansett that was going to stay neutral was like, yeah, no, I think I'm in this now. Philip was nowhere to be seen because he was trying to get more people to help him fight. He ended up heading to upstate New York to see if he could get the Mohawk tribe to join in. And in return, they ended up killing a large part of Philip's army instead of joining him. On February 1676, Metacomet and what was left of his army returned to Massachusetts. And at the same time, Ganachet, who was the war leader of the Narragansett, was pissed about what just happened to his village. He got an army together of about 2,000, which was double the size of the English army, and they just followed the west side of Narragansett Bay, burning any English houses, settlements, villages they could find. A few days later, Providence was attacked. Fires were burning everywhere. In August 1676, a group of about 500 Nipmuc and the Wampanoag warriors circled around an English army, slaughtering them all. May of 1676, the Nipmuc, who were like a big part of wiping out the English, were basically slaughtered down to nothing. There was like nothing left of their tribe. Disease and lack of food was wiping out a large portion of the Wampanoag. Hundreds started giving up to the English surrendering. Plymouth started seeing the benefit of how the Native Americans fought and tracked and tried to start to make allies with them to pull more over on their side. At this time, Metacomet went back to his home, Mount Hope, and Captain Benjamin Church hears of this. So he, along with a small English army and the allied Native Americans that he could rally up, went to attack Mount Hope before dawn on August 12th. Mount Hope was surrounded by Church's army, where they were just started shooting. Two of the soldiers saw an Indian running through the woods, and one fired towards the running man but misfired. So John Alderman, a praying Indian, shot his rifle towards the man, killing him. They approached the corpse and recognized him as King Philip. Alderman sliced off King Philip's hand and put it in a jar as almost a prize. It said that he would charge people later to see it, where he was quartered and beheaded. His body was hung in trees, and his head was placed on a pipe in the town square for 25 years. Now what stands there is a rock with a plaque commemorating King Philip's life. I went there a few months ago. I'll post a picture of it. King Philip's wife, who actually he married his brother's widow. No, his brother's widow's younger sister. And her, along with one of King Philip's children, were sold into slavery. I couldn't find how many children exactly he had. King Philip's elder chief, Lieutenant Anawam, was tracked down by Captain Church. Anawam, instead of fighting, he said, okay, let's sit down and have a meal together. So they sat and had a meal, and he gave him King Philip's belt, which is a huge sign of respect. And Anawam, in return, was taken and executed. The English wanted to prevent more problems, so the natives that did survive were killed, sold into slavery, or converted to Christianity and fled west to live in hiding, which this war set a tone for how Native Americans would be treated and be almost shoved away onto reservations. This brutal conflict and slaughter of so many is said to be what has left a curse on what is now called the Bridgewater Triangle. Thank you so much for listening. And like I said, I just did a brief overview of this whole thing, so this is something you definitely should look into. It is part of the American history, and it is important to remember how badly the Native Americans were treated, to not have a repeat of this in history ever again. To remember how the Native Americans welcomed the Europeans and in turn were slaughtered and were robbed of their land. Thank you so much for listening. You could find us on all social media. We're on Patreon. Or if you have a story you'd like to share or you'd just like to reach out, you can email me at ouchwasthataghost@yahoo.com. And thank you guys again for all the support you've shown me. I really appreciate it. Bye.